When night falls, when shadows cover the streets, there's always that sense of unease that creeps over us. A fleeting sensation of not being alone. It was that very feeling that gripped the people of Nogent-sur-Oise in the 1970s. A predator lurking in the darkness, a man who attacked when no one could see him coming, striking without warning. Marcel Barbeault, known as the Shadow Killer, he chose his victims at random, leaving behind a trail of fear and mystery. Today I'm going to take you deep into this case, a case that left a mark on me, that stole years of sleep, that devoured me from the inside. My name is Paul Lefebvre. I was a young investigator, freshly arrived in the Oise region, when the first murders were reported. It was a job I had long dreamed of, but the excitement soon gave way to anxiety, then terror. I thought my job would be that of a protector, but I felt like I was chasing a ghost. And that ghost was Marcel Barbeault. This story is as much mine as it is his. The story of a man caught in the net of evil, of an elusive killer, and nights spent scrutinizing clues that might not even exist. The story begins on a grey morning in 1969. The streets of Nogent-sur-Oise were wrapped in a winter torpor. News of a sudden death spread like wildfire. A woman named Jacqueline Cartier had been found dead. I remember that moment very well. It was one of my first crime scenes. We arrived at a small, worn-out house, one of those places where life seemed to go on peacefully. But as soon as I crossed the front door, I felt the contrast between the apparent tranquility and the violence that had erupted here. Jacqueline Cartier lay on the floor, a bullet straight through her heart. Everything was silent. Not a sound, as if the whole world was holding its breath at this tragic scene. I observed every detail, the position of the body, the back door slightly open, overturned furniture. The first conclusion was a burglary gone wrong, but despite this assumption, something didn't add up. The killer had left many valuables untouched. I had this feeling, this hunch, that this murder wasn't ordinary. We questioned the neighbors. No one had seen or heard anything. It was as if death had entered silently, striking without a trace. That day, I knew we were dealing with something different. It wasn't just a botched burglary. It was something much darker, a premeditated cold crime. And Nogent-sur-Oise would never be the same after that day. No one could have imagined at the time that Jacqueline would be the first in a long line of victims. For many, it was an isolated incident, but for me, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years, a feeling that something much bigger was lurking in the shadows. After Jacqueline's death, life resumed in Nogent-sur-Oise, but not for long. 4 years passed before terror struck again. In February 1973, another woman, Suzanne Foucault, was found dead, also shot. And then in April, Gisèle Lyotard. Each new victim brought with it a growing sense of frustration, an inability to connect the events. I remember the day Suzanne Foucault's body was found. It was a freezing morning, and the pale winter light only intensified the horror of the scene. Suzanne had been killed with surgical precision. There was no sign of struggle, no clues on the doors or windows. It was as if the killer knew exactly how to enter and leave without being seen, without leaving a trace. Bodies kept turning up, but no tangible clues emerged. Women, alone, coldly murdered at home or in isolated places. The killer was methodical. He struck without leaving a trace, as if he were invisible. He seemed never to make a mistake, leaving the authorities overwhelmed, frustrated. On my end, the pressure mounted every day. Nights grew longer, haunted by those faces, by the unanswered questions gnawing at me. I remember one evening in particular. I was at my desk, surrounded by photos of the crime scenes. Tired eyes, vacant stare. I had no leads. Nothing that could lead me to the killer. I was at my wit's end, and the town was in growing fear. No one knew who would be next. No one knew how to stop it. The investigators tried to link the victims to find a motive, but nothing seemed to fit. The killer appeared to pick his targets randomly, with no apparent connection between them. The killer had a signature, not a physical one, as in classic investigations, but a psychological one. He sowed terror by choosing victims at random. He loved confusion, fear, the feeling of power over the town. He chose women with no apparent link, plunging the town into paranoia. It was in 1975 that things began to take a different turn. Until then, we were only talking about isolated murders. But in 1975, the number of victims began to rise, and the similarities in the crime scenes led us to consider a darker hypothesis: a serial killer. A man who took pleasure in stalking, killing, and vanishing without a trace. I still remember the call we received about Simona Marion. I felt a kind of nausea upon arriving at the scene. A quiet woman with no history who lived alone. She was killed in her home with no signs of forced entry. A bullet to the head. The killer knew exactly where to strike, where to be unseen. I spent hours in her house, examining every corner, looking for the slightest clue, but nothing. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if death had come without noise, without disturbing anything. Simone's house was modest. Simple decor, family photos on the walls, personal belongings that told of her quiet life. And in the middle of all that, the cold violence of death. It was disconcerting, terrifying. Every corner of that house seemed to scream at me the absence of clues, the absence of answers. It was the first time I felt such helplessness. There were many of us working on the case, but the killer always seemed one step ahead. He was always there, somewhere, in the shadows. We were already calling him the Shadow Killer because he seemed to belong to the night, invisible and elusive. He was a ghost who struck and vanished without leaving a trace. The people of the town began to change their habits. Women no longer dared go out alone after dark. Doors were locked and bolted. Fear had taken hold, and I felt it too. The killer controlled us all, forcing us to live in terror, and we had no way to stop him. The following year, in 1976, an unexpected event changed everything. We finally had a witness. A woman had survived an attack. She had seen the killer, or at least a silhouette in the night. The killer had made a mistake. For the first time, he had left someone alive. I remember meeting this woman. She was terrified, her hands still trembling as she spoke to us. But there was something different in her eyes too, determination. She wanted to help us. She remembered details no one else would have noticed. The man's silhouette, the way he moved, even the smell of his jacket. It wasn't much, but it was more than we ever had. That night, I knew we might have a chance to catch him. We intensified our search, increased patrols, watched every corner of the town. We finally had a lead. Every team member knew this was our chance. The killer's mistake gave us hope. And then, in February 1976, that hope came to fruition. Marcel Barbeault, a neighbor with no history, a man living an apparently ordinary life, was arrested. He had been there, under our noses, all along. An ordinary man, invisible among the others. When I saw him, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was both a relief and a chilling revelation. What we had been searching for all those years was nothing more than a man among men. There was nothing in his appearance that could betray the violence he was capable of. That was the most terrifying thing. He looked like anyone, a neighbor, a colleague, someone you might pass on the street without a second glance. But behind that mask of normalcy hid a ruthless predator. In 1981, after years of investigation and hard work, Marcel Barbeault was put on trial. I was there in the courtroom, among the many witnesses and journalists. The shadow killer was being tried for 8 murders and 1 attempted murder. Throughout the trial, he remained stone-faced, denying everything, refusing to speak. He seemed to feel no emotion, no remorse, no regrets. The courtroom was packed. The victims' families were there, journalists, curious onlookers. The atmosphere was heavy, full of anger, pain, despair. Marcel Barbeault remained impassive, as if he were detached from everything happening around him. He never confessed, never explained why he did what he did. The silence he offered to each question was unbearable. When the verdict came down, I remember a wave of relief washing over me. Sentenced to life imprisonment. Justice had been served. But leaving the courthouse that day, I didn't feel the victory I had hoped for. I knew that even behind bars, Marcel Barbeault would keep his secrets. I knew that some questions would remain unanswered, that some nights would still be haunted by the shadows he left behind. Today, looking back on this case, I realize how evil can hide under the most ordinary appearances. Marcel Barbeault was a man like any other, a neighbor, a friend perhaps, and yet he was capable of acts of indescribable cruelty. Nogent-sur-Oise will never be the same. The memories of those years of terror have marked every street, every home. Marcel Barbeault was a shadow killer, but his crimes shone a light on something dark in all of us. Fear, mistrust, the inability to understand what drives a man to such acts. These questions will probably remain unanswered, but they will continue to haunt us long after the courtroom lights have gone out, long after the newspapers have stopped talking about it. This story is based on real events involving the Marcel Barbeault case. However, the perspective of the investigator presented here is fictional and serves to add a narrative dimension to the account. For more content on criminal cases, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell to never miss an update.